So, welcome to another episode of There's No Planet B, brought to you by Independence Live Media. I'm Marlene Halliday. I'm hosting the series of conversations with climate activists, and we've got as far as episode 6. And this week, I'm talking to some of the people who are involved with Glasgow Calls Out Polluters. And in fact, we're going to be talking to three of them. Here they are. We've got Scott, Cahill, and Lindsay. And thank you, all three of you, for being prepared to come on and chat to us here. Scott and I, we've talked before. You've been a guest on the radio side of Independence Live Media, so it's great to have you back, Scott. Um, so we're going to we're going to talk about. We're going to first of all hear from each of Cahill and Lindsay and Scott about what they were up to as activists in Glasgow COP. So be good before we do that. It would be good, perhaps, Scott. Could you give us a bit of background about Glasgow Calls Out Polluters? You know what you do and why you do it.
Yeah, of course. Hi there, and good to be on. It was a campaign that was kind of 2 years in the making, really, because of like the kind of COVID delay and stuff. So we kind of organised around like one particular issue at COP, although it's what we see to be one of the most serious issues that's kind of at play, and that is like the role of like big polluting companies in terms of influencing the political process around COP. So think about big polluters. You can think of companies like Shell, BP, Chevron, Bayer, these kind of big, massive multinational companies. And they tend to have like quite a lot of lobbying influence and privileged access at COP. That ranges from so many things, but also includes things like sponsorship too. And this has been a long fight, right? So people have been fighting against this for 25 to 26 years now. So for us, it was probably the question we were asking ourselves was, it's kind of weird when the COP comes to your city. Like, I still can't quite understand why Glasgow, of all the places in the world, ended up hosting this massive event. But there's probably some responsibility to do what you can to like stand in solidarity with those kind of experiencing the sharpest impacts of the climate crisis. And we felt that taking to task big polluters and doing what we could to support that kind of long-standing fight was one way in which we could be good examples of solidarity. So there's like plenty of important issues that big polluters try to influence at the COP, from like agenda items to like, and we can touch on some of these later, I'm sure, to like so-called false solutions, to things like pushing the idea of like net zero very hard. So for us, it was about doing what we could to be in solidarity with people fighting against these companies that we think are pretty like illegitimate. I think that's about it, roughly, in terms of a kind of intro of what we're about.
And what I think from what you said earlier when we were chatting, I think, Scott, that were you coordinating things a bit behind the scenes while COP was actually on? What were you up to?
Yeah, that was it. I actually wasn't out and about as much as what I thought I'd be. I was taking more of a kind of coordinating role, and that was often just like linking people together from like Scotland, the rest of the UK, and from across the world, because obviously everyone's kind of descending on Glasgow at the one time, and like finding ways to like make sure that through our kind of connections and contacts, people are well connected and therefore had the chance to get to know each other. And obviously some actions that people did were more on the kind of risky side. So it was a chance to like, just to like create that space for people to like kind of come together. And ended up doing a lot of behind the scenes support as well when actions were happening. I was often doing the press and doing like kind of social media. Again, something mostly it's just about when this is going on, it's where you can be most useful, right? And particularly with me doing like a lot of that other stuff, doing like a lot of the other kind of behind the scenes organising, doing the kind of press and social media and all that for actions, was probably the most useful I could be.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's good, isn't it? I mean, that there's a lot of there's a momentum that has to be kept going, especially with social media. So I'm sure that was a pretty useful job you were doing in the background. So, Cathal, if we move on to you, you were a bit more out and about, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, so it was quite an interesting experience to me because, yeah, about 2 or 3 weeks before COP, I was like, we had done something called the Scottish Polluters Awards, and then I'd been quite involved in organising that. And then once that was finished, it was like, okay, let's see what's going on in COP. But it didn't really have like masses of things planned, so it was like, I wonder what I'm going to get involved with when that comes about, because that's been our big focus. But because we're quite a small group, it's always like difficult to, well, usually focus on multiple things at once. But when COP came along, yeah, I was involved. On the first day, I was involved in something which was just like this kind of stunt with a group called Market Forces. Were kind of dressed up in like race car costumes. They had a thing called Race to Zero, and they were kind of calling out Barclays Bank. And that was just a little thing that took a couple of hours. But then after that, I was involved in a number of kind of disruptions. We kind of went to this event at the University of Glasgow, which was organised around the sort of UK and Italian Chamber of Commerce. And there was a group there called ENI, which is one of the big 7 oil majors, which was kind of trying to present its green credentials. And we kind of went in there and we kind of made a link with Fridays for Future Italy, and we kind of sort of called them out, basically stopped the person from any kind of speaking, and made some speeches, sang some songs, and and that was really the start of it. And then we've done quite a few other events like that. I did another one which was like about institutional activism, where I think it was Microsoft, NatWest, SSC, and maybe Scotch Power, some of the sponsoring companies for COP, were basically running this event on what it means to be an institutional activist, which we thought was a bit of an oxymoron, because even if you're an activist within an organization, if you're sanctioned by the organization, you're an advocate, you're not an activist. It doesn't make any sense. Yeah. So we kind of went in there and we kind of had a slogan which was "Drop the Act," and we called out the different companies in there, and they really didn't expect us, which was really quite funny, because if there was one event where activists were 100% going to turn up, it was an event where companies were trying to co-opt the idea of what it means to be an activist. Yeah. So that was also that. I mean, all of these things got like some media attention because we'd kind of, I suppose, created some contacts in the run-up to COP, and then kind of had a way of just, you know, quickly producing press releases and stuff like that. So those were a couple of things. I think I was involved in like a sample of a lot of the different types of direct actions as well. So some more spiky stuff. But yeah, I just kind of threw myself into it, and it was really good because there was all these platforms. Like before COP, we had to kind of create platforms. We had to do a lot of work to put together, say, the Polluter Awards, you know, because we're a small group, we've got no money. But the people attending, the corporations were creating their events, spending months creating these events. So it was just a fantastic time for us just to do a little bit of work to kind of get in there at the right time, and we could have quite a big impact. And they did all the work for us, so that was really quite satisfying.
And Lindsay, let's come to you. What were you doing? What sort of actions were you involved with?
So I came from a slightly different start point from these two, in that I just moved back to Scotland this year and wasn't really like plugged into any networks yet. But with the COP coming up, I'd been involved in climate activism and anti-nuclear stuff over in France where I was living. So with the COP coming up, I thought this is like the time. Something must be going on. Like I need to kind of get. And I kind of got hooked in by joining into some online meetings of Climate Camp Scotland, which is like was created in 2019 with the sort of aim of building up mass mobilizations against the fossil fuel industry in Scotland with the aim of like shutting it down eventually. So yeah, just from sort of a couple of online meetings like that, I then transitioned into real life, met some people in real life, one of which was Scott. And then from there kind of got invited into a sort of group of activists who were like all in the same position, really thinking like, this is coming up, this is like almost upon us. We need to really like kind of try and get it together and do, you know, get things happening. So from there, that led into being involved in various actions during the 2 weeks. Some spiky, some less spiky. But alongside that, I'd also sort of, my other kind of point of contact had been, or kind of entry point rather, had been to sign up to the COP26 coalition, which was happening during that whole time as well. And for people that maybe didn't know what that was, this was like a coalition of civil society groups, like some climate justice groups, some sort of more social justice focus groups, and they put on like a fantastic 4-day counter summit in the middle of COP, but also like throughout that 2 weeks had movement assemblies every day. So they were bringing together some people. The format was always somebody who'd been inside the COP who would come and report back, like feedback to that assembly, and then you'd have a variety of speakers on a given theme per day. So I was just purely like doing kind of welcoming, volunteering with that, but which was allowed me to just listen in on some like really great speakers, and they also did like a lot of work in actually helping logistically bring people over who were not invited into the Blue Zone. A lot of like Indigenous delegates and different NGOs, different activists, grassroots people. So they really like did an enormous amount of work behind the scenes to get that happening, and did a good job in like really like helping push that narrative of climate justice, and pointing out how exclusionary the actual official COP was this year, even more than ever, especially with COVID and the sort of vaccine apartheid situation. So yeah, that was me kind of a bit in both zones, just kind of my 2 weeks to being involved. So it was
sounds like you landed and back in Scotland and were running immediately, Lindsay. Actually, it was quite
not
a time.
quite immediately, but like definitely started to sprint in those last 2 weeks. So I'm hoping. I feel like it hopefully is like a good time to start building momentum actually.
So for I mean, how does it feel? I mean, maybe like Cathal and Lindsay, so you were out there doing things, but Scott, I'm sure you're out in the streets at times as well, and whether it's an action demo or a walk or a march or something. I mean, how do you feel when you're doing that? Is it like something that gives you a real lift? I mean, do you feel a bit apprehensive about it doing a bit, or how does it affect you yourself? Go on then, Lindsay.
For me personally, it's like it's the thing that makes me feel the best in the face of like climate despair, which is like a very real emotion. Is the complete antidote to that is doing things with people who also care, and I would add to nuance that, I would say like the more you're in a sort of activist space, like the stronger that feeling is, as opposed to like for me like the 6th of November, the big march with everyone was great, but it's not necessarily the time that I feel the most like fired up. I quite like doing things that you've really like had a hand in helping prepare.
I can understand that. And I mean, Cathal, just going back to some of the actions that you described. So you've gone into, as you say, some big, conglomerate has put a lot of effort into creating an event, and you and the others managed to get in there, and it sounds like you were doing a good job of disrupting some of them. I mean, how do you feel, as you just before you go in there, and then as you actually start disrupting it? How does that leave you feeling?
I mean, I suppose like with the COP, preparation times were so short. Like with some of these events, we'd kind of tagged them maybe a week or a couple of weeks before, but we hadn't really done any substantial preparation until probably 2 days before or something like that. So I think the timeline is so short that you don't really have any time to practice your speech or anything like that. You know, you kind of, you write something the night before or something like that, and you read it off, you know, your phone or whatever like that. You know, you do the best you can. I mean, the most important is to be clear and to kind of, you know, we're not necessarily, you know, we're not doing a debate where we have to be. So you don't have to worry too much about remembering your script and all that. Because, so in that sense, I think it's just anticipation. And I think once you probably do it once or twice, you realize it's not necessarily that hard if you're doing it with other people. I mean, I think, you know, hats off to whoever probably starts it off, because once they start it off, then it's like it's on, and like, you know, you kind of get strength from that. So I think it takes, you know, a bit more courage to be the first person to stand up and do it. But I think because, you know, there's other people present and they're often standing with you, then it's not too tricky. And I think it does feel satisfying because a lot of these things were also live streamed and things like that. So they weren't able to necessarily immediately, you know, limit the kind of viewership and all that kind of stuff. That there was people watching it, they seen what went on, and they just had to do some sort of damage control. So yeah, I mean, I think the importance is that it did feel like these things have an effect. You know, it's important, I think, when you're doing these things, not to put excess pressure on yourself to kind of to expect to have an effect on a scale which maybe is unreasonable, you know. So I think we have to be aware of the scale at which we operate. That's why I think these big mass mobilizations like the march are important. I personally was quite disappointed because it ended up like usual in Glasgow Green, when I think it should have ended up somewhere where, you know, was more pertinent to what was, you know, near the, I mean, the Blue Zone is quite a bottleneck to get in there, but I still think it would be better even if that road was blocked or something like that, because it just kind of, to me, highlighted the fact that, the mass mobilization part of it still has a limited effect. You know, it's a thing, people get together in the day, but then after that day, there's no real sense of what that achieved beyond showing people that a lot of people care.
I mean, you that's true. I mean, you get a lot of, you know, exposure on TV channels, and I mean, also foreign, you know, not just UK, but foreign TV channels of, you know, a big shot looking back up, I don't know, one of the streets in the town, and it's full of marchers. I mean, I suppose that has an impact when it happens. But yeah, I can see what you mean, and I suspect that about it ending up in Glasgow Green, I suspect that is pretty well, you know, that's what Glasgow Council and the police are used to, and they know it's a place where, you know, you can, it's big enough to take a large impact, a large group of people entering it. So I suppose that's one reason. But I do see what you mean, actually, and once you get to at the end of a march at Glasgow Green, it can feel almost a bit of an anticlimax sometimes. I haven't done it much, but once or twice. Didn't manage to get to that one while COP was on. So when you're tell for people who are watching, what actually happens when you start to disrupt a meeting? Do you suddenly become aware of the security guys approaching you, or do you just wait and see what happens? Do you see sort of like shocked looks on the official presenters' faces? What's it like?
I'll just comment on that quickly. I think one of the factors, especially, I don't know how crucial this is, but because a lot of the different, even the big polluters are trying to reposition themselves to kind of convince the public that they're on the side of climate solutions. I think they often don't necessarily want to be seen explicitly, or they maybe find it more difficult to repudiate activists in certain contexts.
Yeah.
So often what happened in the things is that, especially in the universities, the security just was like, all right, are you finished yet? All right, you've had your time. You ready to go? So we're kind of like, no, just a few. So there wasn't really outright hostility per se, and in terms of the way that the people in the panels or these things dealt with it, it was just to sit there and kind of either look kind of shocked or bemused or just, but not really willing to. I mean, I think when I spoke at one point, there was a guy in the audience who tried to talk over me or something like that. He was saying something about others, and I don't know, like, then he kind of fell off. So, I mean, it was kind of interesting. I suppose what's interesting is, like, we were keen to kind of continue these tactics beyond COP, so it's going to be interesting to see how people respond outside COP. But yeah, I mean, once things got going, I think the experience across our group was that we managed to kind of do what we wanted to do, and then kind of like marched out with a song or something like that. So it was.
Yeah. Lindsay, how did you find it?
Well, actually, I just have a question for Kathleen and Scott, maybe. I'm just wondering, like, if you continue that tactic, if that becomes like more predictable, whether there'll be like a kind of firmer response, or else a sort of filtering system where they try and kind of stop you from getting in the first place. I don't know.
Yeah, good question. What do you think, Scott?
I mean, I think it's possible. I think it's probable, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing either. It's almost, to a certain extent, a win that corporations don't feel they can perform in public without receiving some sort of challenge. So to a certain extent, I think that might happen. I'd be surprised a little bit, because I don't think corporations really think, in terms of like the PR stuff, they might not think that far ahead, but they might make moves to make certain events like less accessible, right? So like there were some events at COP26 where it was £600 to get in or whatever, and therefore it's only for a certain class of people. But that also, I guess, leads to like new ways in which it can be challenged, and obviously the fact that they are doing events for £600 or whatever, that's just one figure for one event. That kind of tells its own story about like what interests they're serving anyway.
Yeah. So, how are you left feeling? Having done all that, because obviously, you and the others involved with the group have put in a lot of hard work and gone and being in situations where I can imagine if I was doing it, actually, I would certainly feel a bit exposed, kind of going in to do that. Hopefully, I would have managed to pluck up the courage to do it. So now that that's all over, how are you left feeling? Do you have a sense of maybe a momentum that's picked up? Do you think, what sort of effect do you think it was a effective set of actions? Are you pleased with how it went? Scott, why don't you carry on? Tell us a bit about how you feel now it's over.
Broadly speaking, like in terms of like connections and solidarity and like and this isn't to be underestimated, but just like making good pals and strengthening bonds with people that you organize with, 100% a success. And we're all the people that were kind of doing those things are in a far better place now than what they were even at the start of November. So unquestionably positive in that sense. I think the actions we did were important. They had at least some sort of impact, and even if that impact is that corporations are less likely to feel comfortable, pushing, like heavily financed nonsense in public spaces, I'm sure that's going to be at least one effect of the actions. Some other actions we did also push back against things like, or tried to push forward things like loss and damage to to a more central place in the climate agenda. Whether we actually achieved that with those actions, like there was one dinner that got disrupted. That it was by, I mean, it was a dinner in that Goals House place, which was where the engine works is in Maryhill. It's basically it was for 8 days, you know, an elite dinner club. Yeah, Leonardo DiCaprio was there on the 2nd, but we weren't disrupting Leo. Like we're all quite big fans here. On the 8th, they had a big lobby group. Catho's like actually shaking his head, but we'll park that for another day. But yeah, that was like an industry lobby group, and they were having a dinner on Loss and Damage Day. So they represent BP, Shell, a lot of the companies. Again, they're one of the worst people at the COPs. And they were having a dinner themed around loss and damage. And for us, that was a bit of a farce. Here are people who should literally be liable for the climate damages they've caused, having a kind of backslapping dinner. And they're doing everything possible to avoid paying any sort of liability. So we like blocked the dinner didn't happen, and we tried to push forward a make them pay message instead. Yeah. Whether that message really got through, I'm not sure. I don't think it probably got through as much as we wanted, but at the same time, there is still value in making sure industry trade groups who are the worst influence over COP, have some sort of accountability. Beyond that, climate movement wise, obviously it's hard to talk about the COP in like really optimistic terms, because we know that the path we're on is pretty bleak. And whether we as a kind of broad climate justice movement did enough, I'm a little bit uncertain, but at the same time, like this was a context like no other. Like everyone I know was like stretched, and doing everything they could. So it's really hard to say, I guess.
Yeah. I can understand that. So I'm just looking at the comments that are coming in. A couple of people were agreeing actually with what you said, Cathal, about the march ending up at Glasgow Green, and perhaps that was always where it was going to happen. But there might have been another place where it would have had more of an impact. And I see someone. Human love, solidarity. Thanks for your comment. Sort of just again, kind of agreeing with what you've just said, Scott, that corporations do not like embarrassment, and bad publicity. The truth when it gets out hurts them. Of course, getting the truth out is what's difficult. So if we move on, if we go into, what do you think yourselves about the outcome where we are now? We've got a Glasgow Climate Pact. Are you how optimistic are you feeling about that?
I can come in on that. I saw we all put our hands up at the same time there. I'll come in on that. Yeah, I mean, maybe not a surprise to people listening. I don't have much great to say about the Glasgow Climate Pact. In fact, I'm actually surprised it's got a name, because, precious little was actually agreed upon. The only thing that was really kind of formalised in a kind of serious way was the issue around carbon markets. Okay, that's a really boring name. I'm not going to go into the details of it. I don't know if you remember the thing I was speaking about the last time we spoke, and it was the part of the Paris Agreement that was written by Shell. That is the part that got agreed upon. So the one success they had really is something that I consider to be profoundly destructive. I mean, I'm not alone. That's quite a common position in the climate justice movement. Carbon markets are awful, and they just allow big polluters to keep on polluting whilst paying lip service to like planting trees or something. That's basically the idea. The stuff on loss and damage. So there was supposed to be finance for loss and damage. This was agreed in 2009 in Copenhagen, and there's the kind of principles of the UN kind of say that rich countries have a bit more responsibility, which is true, and these countries agreed to pay £100 billion per year to so-called developing countries by 2020, and it's now 2021, and it's still not happened. And the United States, with the support of the EU and the UK government, are the biggest blockers to that. They do not want any discussion on liability for climate change. So that's like profoundly disappointing. Like that's something that could make a difference. 100 billion is honestly nowhere near enough either. The estimates are in the trillions for what's needed. So it's this paltry amount. And yeah, the rich nations aren't even willing to give that aside.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the stuff, fossil fuels was mentioned. I mean, can we even call that a success? I mean, maybe, if we're really want to stretch the terms. Yeah, the terms of success.
I mean, I suppose that's true. That's what was said. Was it? Well, for the first time, coal and fossil fuels get specifically mentioned, which just seems incredible. It's taken 26 years to get to that state. So, Lindsay, you wanted to say something about this. Do you want to carry on now from Scott?
I feel like Scott's pretty much covered it. I mean, I think it's hard to be disappointed about something that you had very, very low expectations of in the first place. The only thing I was encouraged by, I suppose I was just like not engaging massively with what was going on inside because I was so wrapped up in what was going on outside. And for me, it was an interesting contrast to being in Paris in the when it was the COP21 here, and subsequent kind of the subsequent kind of build up of the climate movement that I kind of experienced here. I was like heartened by the sense I had that the general public or the kind of messages around climate change are getting it. I don't know whether this is just through my own filter being more engaged myself, but I get the sense of it being a more politicized response and a less kind of vague and kind of blame-free kind of response where we talk about a general kind of we humanity who need to pull our finger out and get this sorted, and a more like focus on, well, I mean, this completely ties into the work of Glasgow Calls Out Polluters, like completely like shining a spotlight on who is preventing us getting there. Like, why are we 26 COPs on? Why are we still in this shitty situation? So it's like really just like, and you don't have to scratch the surface too much to start to understand that it's a question of all these vested corporate interests. So I was like, encouraged by that and by the kind of focusing. Again, this is all happening outside of the COP, largely on climate justice, and that message of like responsibility lies with certain countries and with specific individuals in those countries, even, and that just the notion of that it's a justice issue. Actually, it's like it really comes down to that, and it's interconnected with a lot of other issues that we're like facing en masse now, like pandemics and poverty, etc. It's all like part of the same like capitalist system that we're living under. So yeah, that heartened me, I suppose, just to sense that there were less panels saying like, oh, we need more butterflies and trees, and more panels saying like, down with polluters and polluter pays, and, that heartened me.
And I'm just looking at the comments, and that's one or two people have asked a bit more specific questions. One is see what what you might say to this. Someone's saying but how do you get America and China to follow up on climate? The action that's needed for climate change. Do you think? Well, of course. Well, at least President Biden came. Although he didn't stay that long. But after COP, he and the Chinese government have obviously been talking about what they can do to to take some action forward. Does that how does that strike you? I mean, does it seem? I mean, do you kind of, first of all, do you believe that it'll happen? And do you think that's it may not be a brilliant big step, but is it still worthwhile? Doing that going ahead. What do you think about that one, Carol? We haven't heard from you for a few minutes.
I mean, I suppose in some ways, like, I don't see demanding countries to do more different from demanding, say, especially when it comes to the US, like corporations and stuff like that. I think going through, like, putting pressure on the government, I think who's going to put pressure on the US government is quite tricky. They're the kind of most, I mean, China and the US are powerful. So to me, in some ways, personally, I think we need to put more pressure on corporations, because I think in some ways, the US position is primarily serving corporations, not primarily serving its general populace. In terms of them, they were quite key in kind of watering down actually the kind of the language on fossil fuels, even though they're pointing the kind of the finger at, you know, China and India. It was, you know, particularly focusing on coal, which isn't so much of a kind of an economic interest for the US now, which is much more involved in gas. So it serves them that actually that was, you know, fossil fuels weren't maybe kind of the language wasn't quite as strong as it could have been.
Yeah.
They're kind of saying this because of so. But in terms of putting more pressure, like for me, COP felt pretty flat, both from, I think, like I don't think even the people who are pushing things like net zero and you know, who wanted to, like the US, who really wanted to come out of this looking really good, I don't think they looked as good as they hoped. But I also think the activism in general, like even though we had quite a successful COP, I'd say, I don't think in general activism was anywhere near as successful as I would like it to be. It kind of shows maybe, I don't know, like, I mean, I've also heard like one of the reasons that Glasgow was chosen was because they didn't expect like there to be a crazy activist response like you might get in somewhere like London, you know, for various reasons. So I've heard that Glasgow was quite strategically chosen. Not that there isn't passion and all that, but maybe it's organised and orientated towards other areas.
Yeah.
So going back to the kind of, for me, I feel like COP didn't come down hard enough, obviously, against the fossil fuel companies were supposedly excluded from official spaces. They managed to get in through other means. And so I think even from their perspective, it wasn't as successful as they hoped, because like I said, they're realigning their position. They're going into trying to promote their hydrogen interests, their carbon capture and storage. But I do think that it didn't really hold them to account. You know, so in some ways, yes, it's about holding countries to account, but it's fundamentally about holding these corporations to account. And I think that wasn't done very successfully at COP. I think, you know, Shell and Exxon, and interestingly enough, actually, a lot of the you know, like I just, my electricity supplier, Bulb, just went bust. And then a number of, you know, green electricity suppliers have gone bust over the course of COP. So that kind of showed how kind of fragile those business models were, which is fascinating. They went bust because of their gas elements of their business. Whereas, you know, all, you know, Exxon, Shell, well, people have been transferred over to Shell, you know, their electricity supplies. So to me, you know, these companies have to be the losers in all this thing. That's my feeling. It's like we always talk about climate winners and losers, and like at GCOP, we really know who the losers should be, and we should do everything in our power to make them the losers, because if they're not the losers, everybody else kind of loses. So US, China, all that's important, but these, especially the US, China's a kind of a weird entity, because I think the kind of government and the private sector are much more sort of fused, and the government's quite powerful in a different kind of way internally than the US is. But especially with the US kind of primarily serves the interests of its corporations, and so the corporations are the kind of main aspect of that kind of relationship that we feel like we need to really target.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting talking about, you know, bringing, well, the corporations, bringing them to boot. I mean, some of those corporations, their annual turnover is a lot bigger than some of the turnover of some of the smaller countries that were there. So the countries there as a country, the big corporations are, as you say, like they're maybe the ones that it would be great if we really could bring them to book and claw back some of the billions of profits that they've made over the last 30 or 40 years, well, 40 or 50 years. So I've just I think someone's just asked you if there was much of a presence of animal agriculture industries at COP, and I think they're wondering because livestock accounting for it something like 16% of greenhouse gas emissions. That they might have been a presence at themselves. Do you know if there was much of a presence for agriculture?
I know there was a little, but it wasn't something I must admit that I followed super closely. I did do some research on something called the intersessionals, which are basically like a kind of before COP, and yeah, I was quite surprised. They're part of the COP process, and I was quite surprised at how many, big dairy companies and stuff were part of things. Like a little bit shocked, and obviously they're quite aware. Well, I mean, I guess the reason I'm not shocked because I know how bad the kind of dairy industry is. It's actually not my area of expertise here. It's just something I'm not clear on is how much decisions about animal agriculture actually get made at the COP, because I thought there was like other kind of there's actually other UN COPs, believe it or not, other COPs, other conferences of the parties, and I'm pretty sure there's like agricultural ones where like decisions more about that get made. But there was quite a strong presence and strong movement for kind of plant-based stuff, and I heard a lot of people talking about it. So I might be missing something. I'd be interested, even if anybody knows in the comments, they might know more about it than me.
Yeah, sure. And do you think? I mean, what do you think yourself? Do you think? I'm just again one of the comments here from Human Love Solidarity, who's been obviously listen to us. I've just he or she just commented, the people have decided the best route is outside the system. So that's presumably meaning the best route to to get things done, to make something to happen, is to go outside the system. So that would be outside, especially the COP system. Go, act effectively inside where you can, but don't think that's going to be the main way to get something done. Do you think? Do you think that's right? Do you think that's where we've got to? 26 years of COPs and with where we are, and as you say, it's not terribly impressive. I mean, it's making small steps, but we haven't got very much time. Do you think that's true, that maybe that we're on the cusp of a much bigger grassroots activist set of actions, and maybe coming to get different kind of interest? I think that might be the way forward.
I could come in on that. That was like from having spent sort of time in the COP26 coalition, so the Alternative People's Summit space. That definitely felt like the message that was coming from practically every speaker that I listened to. Was, I mean, it's a real. Obviously, it's kind of among friends in that type of space, because the people who are there are very much like convinced of the power of like activism, or they've kind of it's already. I mean, it's slightly preaching to the converted, because these people have already decided that COP is a kind of useless exercise. So that very much felt like the message, like the change is going to come from the streets and from the people. But it's a tricky one, because like the fact still remains that like we don't have our hands on the levers of power. So we still are in a position of like feeling that we're just trying to pressurize the people that are in those positions. So it can feel like frustratingly kind of utopian rhetoric sometimes. Like you can like, oh yes, okay, we know exactly, but how do we do this? How do we get from this like pretty dystopian nightmare that we're in to these these ideal scenarios that we've sketched out, and unfortunately, I don't really have the answer to that. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
into kind of like revolutions, or else do we try and just kind of build our parallel systems alongside this capitalist system? Those are never-ending debates, I think. I don't know if
They are indeed never-ending debates, and they come around every decade or so. And I'm old enough to remember the debates about world revolutions that were happening in the late 60s. That's a long time ago from your point of view, obviously. But things do kind of recover. But of course, whatever discussions my generation might have been in back then about taking down the capitalist system. Um, and however well meant, and deeply held those sort of views were, actually the planet was not in danger. Human civilization and the way that the numbers of people that the planet can sustain, that was not in question back then. And of course, that's what's in question now. That's where we haven't got much time left to do it. So we're going to need to close shortly. What do you think? I mean, Lindsay, a wee while back, you mentioned climate emergency, well, depression or despondency, and I mean that doesn't surprise. I mean, you weren't necessarily saying that for yourself, although you may feel it. So if you look at our four pictures, it's quite clear that I am a couple of generations ahead of you three, and although I can feel it very deeply and feel I mean grief, actually quite acute grief sometimes about what I see happening in the world. Um, I'm not going to be around when the worst of it happens. I'll be off the planet or in the planet, buried somewhere. For you and for your generation, that is, that's a much more that's the acute kind of situation that you're having to deal with. So just to finish off with, are you left feeling, you've done something that was good and yeah, of course it's not ideal, but if we wait for ideal, we'll never get anything done. But it started something, and in some way, does it help, that the three of you deal with a possible path where you do just feel despondent and unable to act. Where are you left now?
For me personally, yeah, like I sort of mentioned that earlier, I definitely think action is like the way out of climate despair. But I'd also say, like, I think like a key thing in the movement is maybe it's maybe a double-pronged thing to like try and turn climate despair into like climate rage. That's how I would see it. Like, we shouldn't be despairing and gloomy. We should be like bloody pissed off and know who to direct our anger at, actually, and not just kind of go into some sort of fatalistic mindset of, oh, we're doomed, so what's the point of even trying, etc. But alongside that, I would say like it's quite important to kind of cultivate like joy and friendship and solidarity, and those are the things that like help you to like combat all of this stuff. And yeah, I would say like my experience during the COP was really positive in that sense. Like, it felt like the beginning of friendships and kind of good connections that we can take forward. So that, yeah, it's funny, like kind of the deeper you go into it, almost the better you feel, but it should kind of I don't know, you might think it to have the opposite effect. But yeah, I think that is just so much better than like reading articles and hanging your head in despair, basically.
Yeah. That's good. That's good to hear. Cahill, you got anything along those lines of how you're left feeling? And there you are, relatively young man, and what do you feel about the future ahead of you?
I mean, I think on one hand, I think this is kind of like a perennial like struggle. So to me, I think each generation has their different struggles. I mean, I suppose in the past, if you were kind of like a peasant, you were kind of confined to like a very, very specific strata of society. And if you tried to move outside that, you were basically stamped down in a way that is probably as bad as what a lot of the things that might happen in the next centuries. So I think one of the things is that a lot of parts of the world are already exposed to this kind of really quite a lot of suffering. We in the West, especially if we're relatively privileged, are foreseeing how this is going to extend to us. It's probably going to exacerbate people who are already living in that, but they're already living in terrible conditions. So I think this kind of narrative of we and how we're going to face it, it's much more differential than that. I mean, I suppose for me personally, I always see like life is something quite dynamic. So I always see like there being possibility and different options. It just takes probably more people to believe it, because on the other hand, I think, this kind of whole thing about dual power and all that, I think one of the difficulties is like, obviously people like the fossil fuel companies, they control the infrastructure. They can, so even if we capture the mindset, that's fine, it's great, mindset, superb. But in some ways, unless that capturing a mindset allows you to contest those structures and infrastructures, material damage still persists, at least to the extent where it's going to lead to disaster. So, yeah, I think it's challenging. I think if people are, like Lindsay said, are kind of getting active, doing things, trying to at least live a life which they feel is in keeping with their values, then that helps. And I think that can make a lot of difference. I think we need to be able to deal with also the fact that, things are likely to get potentially difficult over the next century. That doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be the apocalypse, because I think the reality is often much more complex than the continued apocalypse. That doesn't mean it's not going to be terrible, but I also think we need to also recognize the Christianity, the kind of Christian Western mindset, which continuously almost wants to see the end of the world and can't seem to deal with anything in between. So for me, the future is looking very uneven. It is looking like a lot of people could suffer. That's why it's more important than ever for us to really, we're not going to have everybody being winners. But yeah, like I said, if we really I see how we can do as a group and our allies can really start to expose these companies and make them more accessible to regular people, to challenge them in different ways, then I think that can have some effect.
Thank you, Scott. Do you want to just? We're coming to the end quite shortly. Do you want to say anything before we end?
I guess just on the question of hope and the future. I mean, I would broadly echo what's been said. I mean, I guess it's like that kind of distinction between like optimism and hope, right? Which somebody once said to me, and kind of kept it in my brain somewhere. Because I guess it's difficult to be like, if you look at the current trajectory of climate politics and like the kind of science of like how it's all kind of manifesting, it's maybe difficult to hold on to like that optimism. And there is like quite a lot to unpack with what's going on there. And I'm not saying I'm actually good at unpacking that. I actually probably keep it under a lid, because I'm not kind of used to it now. It probably isn't a healthy way to deal with it. I sometimes forget, like, when bad things happen, I'm just like, oh well, X or Y happened. I'm like, well, of course it did, because I knew that was going to happen. But yeah, there's always a hope, right? There's always organising. There's always, no matter where you look, people who are doing some sort of resistance in the face of, complete what some people might term as like a very despairing situation. And a lot of those people came to Glasgow because they feel like they've got a lot to share. And we heard from a lot of people. I think probably all three of us here did, at various points. So yeah, there's resistance everywhere, and there's resistance in Scotland as well, right? Look at all the workplaces that took action. It does exist. It's just a question of like kind of winning power, really.
Yeah, yeah. Well, listen, I've really enjoyed. I've really appreciated being able to talk to you, today, and just kind of get that kind of description of what it was actually like, and yeah, for me, but maybe for other people kind of watching, maybe just it's be good to say thank you so much for what you're doing and for what you did during those 2 weeks. And it sounds like you're going to carry on doing it. So thank you for that. That comes in the future as well. And someone's just commented, or a wee while back they commented, said it's don't know the person's name, but their moniker is No Don't. Just saying, we are the best we've got. And I suppose that's maybe as good a point to finish as well. That it's who's prepared to go out and do something, whether it's what you've been doing, or maybe it's whether a bit more inside the system, whether it's a bit more kind of technically to do with the science or whatever. But yeah, we're the best. We're who we've got. We're the best we've got. And humans love solidarity. As just commented, action is the solution to grief. And yeah, I think I agree with it. I agree with that. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on. And well, hope we'll see you again at some point.
Thanks for
having us. I really enjoyed that.
Spoken as one.
So that was the latest in our series of There Is No Planet B, and we've got another couple of episodes still to record. Hopefully get them done in the next week or so. But thanks again if you've been listening. Those of you who sent in comments, we really appreciate that. It helps us a lot. And we'll see you next time.